In the second of a series from the Scarlet Lens, we will be discussing why borders matter more than values. For much of the post-Cold War era, Western political discourse has been shaped by a comforting belief that values drive global politics, that democracy, human rights and liberal norms shape the behaviour of states, that the world is slowly converging around a shared moral framework. But reality tells a different story. Again and again, when values collide with borders, geography, security and survival, values yield. Not occasionally, but systematically. This is not cynicism. It is geopolitics. The illusion of values drive foreign policy. Western states, particularly the United States and Europe, often describe their foreign policy in moral terms: democracy promotion, human rights, the rules-based international order. Yet these values are rarely applied consistently. They are involved selectively, enforced unevenly, and quietly abandoned when they conflict with strategic interests. This inconsistency is not accidental. It reflects a deeper truth. States exist to survive. Borders define the limits of that survival. Values are subordinate to security. The mistake is not that states behave this way. The mistake is pretending that they do not. Geography is not neutral. It shapes fear, ambition, and threat perception. Russia's behaviour towards Ukraine cannot be understood without geography. Ukraine is not simply another country to Moscow. It is a buffer, a corridor, a historical invasion route. Its borders sit uncomfortably close to Russia's core. None of this justifies war, but it explains it far better than abstract debates about democracy versus authoritarianism. Similarly, China's posture towards Taiwan is not driven primarily by ideology. It is driven by proximity, maritime access, and the vulnerability of its eastern seaboard. Values do not disappear in these calculations. They simply do not lead. Borders define who matters. One of the harshest truths in international relations is that proximity determines priority. States are far more likely to intervene decisively when borders are nearby. Conflicts at the edge of influence provoke urgency. Conflicts far away invite statements. Ukraine receives sustained Western military support because it sits within Europe's security architecture. Yemen does not, despite suffering on a similar scale. Gaza elicits moral language, but limited constraints, because Israel occupies a strategic and geographical position Western powers are unwilling to challenge. Borders create a hierarchy of concern. This is why talk of universal values collapse under pressure. Values claim universality. Borders enforce selectivity. And immigration exposes this contradiction. And no issue receives the limit of the values more starkly than that of immigration. Western states proclaim human rights, dignity and asylum protections. Yet when migrants arrive at borders, these principles quickly erode. Walls are built, patrols are intensified, detentions are normalised, and suffering is reframed as deterrence. The moment a humanitarian issue becomes a border issue, values bend. Compassion is conditional on distance. Rights become negotiable when enforcement becomes politically costly. This is not hypocrisy alone, it's a structural reality. Borders are where most moral abstractions meet political consequences. And NATO is often described as a values-based alliance, a community of democracies. In practice, it's a geographically bounded security pact. Solidarity within NATO exists because borders matter. An attack on Poland feels different from an attack on a distant partner. Collective defence is strongest where geography concentrates threats. This is why NATO's eastern flanks matter more than abstract commitments elsewhere, and why debates around burden sharing are ultimately debates about whose borders are worth defending. Values may justify alliance rhetorically, but geography sustains them materially. And moral leadership is just a myth. Western powers often speak about moral leadership, but leadership in international politics is rarely moral in philosophical senses. It is persuasive power anchored in credibility, consistency, and interest alignment. When Western states condemn violations in one region but tolerate them in another, they lose moral authority, not because they are imperfect, but because borders dictate restraint. Saudi Arabia remains a partner because of energy, geography, and regional influence. Israel remains protected because of the strategic location and alliance structure. Ukraine matters because it sits at the edge of Europe's security perimeter. These are not moral calculations, they are spatial ones. To say borders matter more than values is not to say that values are meaningless. Values shape internal legitimacy. They structure alliances. They influence public opinion. They matter deeply within societies. But in moments of crisis, when survival, territory and power are at stake, values are secondary. The era of recent decades has been treating values as drivers rather than justifiers, as engines rather than narratives. This misunderstands and has produced foreign policy confusion, moral overreach, and strategic incoherence. A more honest approach to global affairs would acknowledge these things. First, that borders, geography, and power define the limits of action. Second, that values are applied within those limits, not above them. Third, that moral language should be used with restraint, not as a substitute for strategy. This does not weaken democracy, it strengthens it. Honesty about interests allows for clearer debates and more credible commitments. Pretending values override borders leads to broken promises and disillusionment. Borders matter more than values because border defines survival. States may aspire to moral consistency, but they operate within geographical constraints. Power flows through territory. Security rests on space. Responsibility diminishes with distance. The world is not governed by ideals floating above maps. It is governed by lines drawn across them. Until foreign policy discourse accepts this, it will continue to misread events, overpromise outcomes, and misunderstand why the world behaves as it does. Understanding geopolitics begins not with what we wish mattered, but with what consistently does. This is the world through a scarlet lens.